from development partners and the like. And these 3 pillars are going to run through the presentation, because they all have different kind of consequences on, I think, the way projects are funded, urban development projects and social projects are funded. And this leads on to the first key message that I think is important when we're framing these sort of discussions, which is how governments are financed matters, because decisions change with the source of finance. I found this quite fascinating, that kind of $1 doesn't necessarily, an increase in $1 from different areas doesn't necessarily see local governments spend that in different ways. And therefore, when we're thinking about how we finance projects, we need to bear that in mind. And this comes from some wonderful evidence in Brazil. I think it was a study over 14 years. And I've tried to kind of infographic it here, but the money that would come from, this is the Brazilian national government up on the top left. And this is kind of the locals on the bottom left is supposed to indicate the local population in terms of their participatory budgeting. So both of these sources of finance went to the different municipal kind of city governments for spending. And you know, a lot of that went onto school infrastructure and kind of educational infrastructure. But what was quite interesting was when both sources of these funding increased, or these financing increased, I should say, when the money from these different areas increased, it actually ended up being spent in a slightly different way. So when there was more money from central government, a lot of it actually ended up going on staff salaries and kind of finding its way, or being maintained within the city government sphere. But actually, when it was locally generated revenues, that actually went on to what, you know, the people kind of wanted more so. And this comes from a lovely paper by Lucy Garden, which is called Tax Me But Spend Wisely, which is about this kind of importance of locally generated revenues, because that's when decision makers have kind of an incentive to grow their local economy, I suppose, because they know that the better that it gets, the more that they stimulate their economy, they're going to see these kind of more revenues coming back. And I think this is a lovely quote, that kind of, government spend increases in tax revenues more towards expenditures that benefit citizens than increases in grant revenues. So that's kind of the first message there. And I think I've got some nice data here from Lagos State and Ogun State, which shows the split of local and central government revenues. And you can see that about, I think, a third comes from national governments and 2/3 from local governments, which is, there's no kind of best split, let's say, but this is quite a good way of showing that you got your kind of local governments have some incentive to increase their revenues, and then the national governments are still providing the kind of financing for public goods and for other aspects that are quite critical. So there are other cities around the world where you actually see 100% of their revenue as national government transfers, and there you actually have this issue where the local government has no incentive to kind of grow their local economy and grow their local revenues, because they're not actually seeing any of it at the end of the day. So I thought that was just quite a nice kind of indication of that key message one. The second key message I want to talk about is that funding does not equal financing. And I'm glad we're having this conversation here about funding, but I think it's a useful distinction, because people often don't make the distinction that often. And the funding aspect is crucial. There's another paper that says, a key hurdle to the implementation of major transportation projects is funding. And this is the paying back aspect of it. When we're talking about urban development projects, we need to ensure that we've got this capital repayment and operational expenditure locked down, because in order to give lenders confidence in the funding, well, in order to attract the financing aspect, the actual capital expenditure, you have to give lenders confidence in this funding aspect. So in order to be able to build your bus lanes, in order to be able to buy your buses, you need to give them the confidence that there's going to be these kind of revenue streams coming further down the line. So I think that's, and I think it's useful when we think about these timeframes as well. That financing aspect, that building of the infrastructure can only be, or that urban development project could only be kind of, a couple of years. But often with urban development projects, we're talking about much longer timescales on the actual life cycle of it, between 2 and 20 years, even longer. So this funding bit, getting that right is really crucial. And I think, so the third key message that I'll talk about is about the economics of these funding models. And we've kind of brought together a bit of a policy framework, I suppose, for thinking about this to try and help decision makers ensure that the funding source of project types and beneficiaries is kind of matched to the actual project itself, and to kind of make sure that those, those private sector, to encourage private sector engagement on the most profitable projects. So those private goods that are going to be profitable, they best suit the kind of the private money. It's often tempting, I think, as local governments to keep those most exciting ones to oneself, but actually then there's all the projects that are left over are the kind of less profitable ones that have more of a social benefit, and therefore the private finance doesn't always want to fund those. And so the way that I like to think about this and have shared with other cities, and this is kind of the one side of economics that we talk about, is thinking about, does one citizen's use of this urban development project restrict other citizens' uses? So we call this kind of rivalrous or non-rivalrous. And this is, of course, across a spectrum. So you've got yes, somewhat, no. And then there's another question about, can you limit citizen use to paying citizens, which we call excludable or non-excludable goods. And when you think about these policy questions, you can begin to kind of put different projects in different buckets, like I can show here. So on the top, we have that, can you limit citizen use, yes or no? On the bottom, we have, does one citizen's use, or sorry, on the left, we have, does one citizen's use restrict other citizens' uses? So when you can limit citizens' use, and one citizen's use restricts others, something like parking spaces or a car park, that's your kind of your typical private good, let's say, which is very much an individual benefit. But when you can't limit, on the opposite side, when we can't limit citizens' use and one citizen's benefit doesn't restrict other citizens, when one citizen's use doesn't restrict other citizens' uses, you have this more kind of classic public good that everyone can gain from. I've lost my mouse, but here you are. So you've got things like your street lighting, your drainage, your clean air, everyone's benefiting from that, from those kind of interventions. From a street light, you can't kind of exclude people. And then you have these sort of other aspects in between where you can limit citizens' use, but one citizen's use doesn't restrict another one's to an extent. So kind of you get more along your toll roads and things like this. And there are different sort of funding models which come on the next slide that follow this, I think. And you can see these sort of here. So this goes back a little bit to that first slide that I was talking about, the different local government revenues. And so typically, I think when we're thinking about funding projects, it's important to use these, think, okay, right, user fees, if we want something like a car park, which has that individual benefit, let's make sure it's paid by those individuals. And on the opposite side, if we have these intergovernmental, if we have these projects like drainage and things that benefit many and are more of a collective good, let's try and have those more collective sources of funding to pay them back. So, and that's also, I think that also ties to the financing aspect as well. I think it's useful to think, right, okay, similarly, where should these financing sources come from? If we can limit citizens' use and restrict other citizens' uses, then yes, maybe that is a great source of private finance, because they know that there's a funding stream that they can get back out of it, and there's some kind of potential profit to be had there. But if it is these more collective benefit public goods with a lot of social welfare benefits, then we need to be looking to those more kind of public financial aspects, whether that be through multilateral development banks, locally generated revenues and the like. And then of course we have kind of PPPs fitting somewhere in between. And we've got some papers here at Cities That Work if people want to kind of understand a little bit more about some of these different financing methods. I kind of ask, I think, please reach out. So what I've kind of done today is I think it's a useful exercise to think through this application to some of Lagos's kind of infrastructure and some of what I've seen Ludi, which I'm just going to be acronizing for now, kind of talking about recently. And I think so we have, I'm just going to move my face. We have something like bike lanes and bike roads, right? And I think it's a useful exercise for us to think through, okay, bike roads, can we limit citizens' use? Yes or no? And does one citizen's use restrict other citizens' uses? And I've changed the table now because I do see it as more as a spectrum. So it isn't necessarily these 4 boxes. But I don't know where people think that goes. But in my opinion, I felt it was sort of down here, right? You can't really exclude citizens from the bike roads. And there's not really an ability to restrict citizens' uses of them. You can't limit citizens' use, sorry, and you can't restrict the citizens' uses. And we have a few more. There's this kind of new discussion in Lagos about public waterways as well. This is a bit tricky because the waterway itself and then the actual vehicles on the waterway are 2 different things. But I didn't know, it's interesting if people are doing this exercise with me, but I kind of thought this sort of fell around here somewhere. So because you can somewhat limit citizens' use in the fact that they often have to get regulated and have these boats, but ultimately it's kind of a public waterway, right? If people want to use it, they can. But as I said, all of this is a spectrum. And then, BRT and bus lanes, of course, as indicated at the beginning, I wrote on the BRT and the DANFO and the transport reforms. And this feels somewhere that you can more easily limit citizens' use. And to an extent, one citizen's use, restricts another one's. And finally, I had here the kind of airport car park, which I think was built a few years ago now, but still, this kind of really falls into that that initial example that I spoke at the beginning, where you can limit them, and it's rivalrous, and therefore that kind of it suits that both the funding regarding these sort of user fees, but the financing for kind of more private finance, as I kind of indicate in this slide here. So I've got another 5 minutes, and I just wanted to kind of talk through this slide. I won't go through this slide, but this kind of touches upon some of that, looking at both the social benefits and the private benefits of different infrastructure, and therefore you think about walking and biking, they're kind of best paid for with these because they have that collective benefit, more collective sources of financing, and arguably on the driving side of things, we need to look at how we reduce those kind of financing those sort of things, because they do have this kind of collective negative consequences. But yeah, I wanted to talk 5 minutes briefly on some potential areas of urban development projects or infrastructure, or at least that was what I was asked to talk about, where potentially often people are very keen on where private finance might be interested, and also wanted to touch upon the growing view of kind of social projects of infrastructure. So yeah, these aren't prescriptions, but kind of provocations, which I wanted to draw upon. Firstly, a precursor, I suppose, is just Lagos per capita doesn't have a considerable amount of money, and this is just the kind of 100 G, but the city budget per capita about $100 US, it seemed from the information we received, which is about the similar level of Dakar, let's say. Well, it is a similar level of Dakar, but when you actually compare, I suppose this chart is a bit horrible for the time, I'm afraid, but it just shows when you compare the country's GDP, it's actually got quite a low level in terms of how much how much that figure is compared to the kind of country's GDP per capita, when a lot of other countries at the city level, they're having a lot more money to kind of fund and finance these urban development projects and social development projects. And I think for Lagos, there's in an interesting space where there is the central point for imported goods for the country, with 80% of freight coming through Lagos. And from what I was looking through some information before I came here, and you see some of these different infrastructure types or urban development projects might not be very efficient. And this is an example from the Financial Times saying how expensive the port infrastructure is in Lagos. And I think there's a new opportunity with the African Continental Free Trade Area that's just started out to look at some new kind of international connectivity projects in Lagos, to think, okay, now we have this new free trade area, how can the city really benefit from trading in primary goods, particularly intermediate goods and final goods? So the intermediate goods are kind of all the aspects that make up the final goods. So all the classic example is the bicycle. So you think about the wheels coming from one area, the chain coming from another area, from another city, and this is I think Lagos is in a unique opportunity, in a unique space now and place with the new free trade area to think about what kind of infrastructure it wants. And this slide just kind of indicates some of that, the different potential areas in domestic market connectivity and international connectivity, but for time I won't go into it. I think it's just an important quote just to touch upon, that when we talk about infrastructure, let's say, we shouldn't see it in aggregate. We should think about it about specific sectors that we want to engage in. And I think in a lot of low income or low middle income contexts, it's useful with scarce resources to address bottlenecks in infrastructure rather than the amount. Where are these bits that are kind of slowing the system down? And particularly with the new free trade area, where are the bits on the borders where we need this kind of inflow and outflow of goods that for value chains, for this quick and easy export and import is most important. And this is some of the findings that I picked up. So on this kind of domestic market and international connectivity on the hard infrastructure side, I found it quite interesting that Nigeria is so just one moment. This was a question that asked people engaging with the kind of infrastructure whether the quality was low or very low. And it's from the World Bank Logistics Performance Index. And you can see that actually Nigeria, compared to its sub-Saharan peers, has better, or at least not as much low quality infrastructure in all areas apart from, this was supposed to be over ports. I do apologize, I changed the slides. But the ports is like the one area where it's actually not quite functioning, or at least the perception is it's not quite functioning as well as in the rest of sub-Saharan Africa, which I thought was interesting considering everything else was kind of deemed more effective or of a better quality. And the other bit I wanted to touch upon, and then I'll stop, is on this kind of international connectivity in logistics and customs, which is this soft infrastructure, which I think is quite important. And here it's actually, I found it quite interesting. It was the kind of the customs agencies and the quality and standards inspection agencies that were the ones that were performing not as well compared to the, again, sub-Saharan African peers. Again, all the other aspects, Nigeria was better, or at least had a higher respondent saying it was kind of a high level of service, but these are the two bottlenecks that they were falling down on. I'm going to stop there. I had some bit on social projects, but I said I was only going to talk for 15 to 20 minutes, and I will keep to that. So if there's some discussion on social projects at the end, we can get into that, but I will, I think I'll finish there, pass it on to the other speaker.
Actually, so since the ministry hasn't joined, unless you have, please do let me know, so that, because I'm not sure who is speaking from the Ministry of Economic Planning and Budget. But since they haven't joined, I mean, you can go ahead, Oliver, and take another 5 minutes or so. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. I will. It was a very brief one, because I thought, let me go back to this. I thought it was quite wonderful. The discussion of these social projects, I think, is quite important. And this was and again, kind of another provocation more than anything else. But I think we often, well, there's a lot of rhetoric at the moment about more kind of human-related infrastructure. I think we see with the US and Biden, they're putting kind of infrastructure around childcare as a core pillar of part of the infrastructure development plan. And in the UK as well, we're seeing, there's been a few studies recently about the quite considerable direct economic returns. And sorry, the slide's a bit messy. I did it this morning after reading some stuff. But you actually see, in terms of investing in care infrastructure, so we're talking, primarily around sort of childcare, the returns were a lot bigger when compared to kind of construction infrastructure. This was a study in the UK, and actually there were interesting gender differences as well, and because a lot more female jobs were created or due to be created from these sort of more human infrastructure, looking at childcare facilities, because women typically they'd be constrained in their participation in the labour market by lack of these sort of facilities, and actually getting women into the labour market through childcare social projects also created kind of wider stimulus returns, because it induced a lot of demand, let's say, because they were getting out, earning money and spending money. There was kind of a much larger ripple effect than typically, let's say, construction or the hard infrastructure we have. And I think it also evidence from Canada was showing it was sort of pro-poor with positive long-term labour supply effects on single mothers, particularly those less educated. So I think it's an interesting discussion that I felt was one that I wanted to bring up today, and I'm not quite sure where it lies, but particularly, while there is an increase in like females in the Nigerian labour force, it does still remain lower than that of males, and there's still twice as many women as men living below the poverty line. So it was just it was kind of more some questions around, should this be an increasing policy priority, particularly considering the amount of the young population of Lagos with high birth rates and huge kind of population expansion, also with kind of rural urban migration separating typical wider family networks of care. Should this be something that, in addition to kind of your classic hard infrastructure or hard urban projects that I think people often advocate, is this something that does have a place for in an agenda setting way, in kind of being able to increase female participation in the labor force, because it is something that's getting traction in other places in the world. And I found it quite interesting, and was reflecting this morning, considering it's just the huge population growth of Lagos, how this potentially could interact with that. And how this also interacts with informal employment, because I understand my other speaker here heads up the informal, I can't quite remember the exact term, but I know Gubenga is doing a lot of work with kind of informal workers. So I was another provocation. But I just wanted to touch upon that as well at the end, because I think the fact that you have that in the title was quite telling to me, and I do think it's important we view these urban development projects, both hard and soft infrastructure, with this kind of human infrastructure aspect. And I will stop there.
Great, thank you so much, Oliver. Yes, and that was a good way to end, actually, because it does bring us to the next speaker. But I just wanted to quickly say a couple of things that I noted from your presentation. They're not questions, so don't worry. But I mean, just this idea of the fact that soft infrastructure is how is it performing? And from what you said, it has better returns than the hard infrastructure, which is quite. I mean, I wouldn't have thought of that thinking about I don't know, trains or things like that, compared to like childcare and infrastructure that's needed for that. So that was quite interesting and eye-opening for me. Also, you mentioned about opportunities with international connections, and we should kind of look into that a bit more with the new kind of free trade zones, and also when thinking about bicycles and the different parts and where they come from around the world, and even thinking about cars, and because I think we have the highest, maybe not the highest, but we have a high population of used cars being bought in Nigeria. So I think there's quite a number of great points that you made, and kind of food for thought in regards to how we finance projects, and also something that you mentioned, which also kind of was eye-opening, was about funding doesn't always equal finance, and actually to get the finance you need assured funding. So that's also quite provocating points, and that we also need to think about. So I will introduce the next speaker, who is Mr. Gbenga Akomolafe. And again, I'll just say, if there's anyone from the Ministry of Economic Planning and Budget, please let me know, because they didn't confirm who will be speaking, but they did say they will be attending. So hopefully they will come at some point. But to the next speaker, which is Mr. Gbenga Akomolafe, he's the General Secretary of the Federation of Informal Workers in Nigeria. Is a 1991 graduate of the University of Ibadan, where he was part of a national student movement that campaigned relentlessly against military rule. He later played leading roles in such pro-democracy and human rights organizations as the Committee for the Defense of Human Rights and the Center for Constitutional Governance. He joined the Trade Union Congress of Nigeria between 1998 and 2002, where he became part of the collective bargaining and negotiations with employers and government. He was also a member of a research network, the Civil Society and Informalization in Nigeria, put together by the Center for Research and Documentation in Kanu, under the coordination of Professor Ruth Mayer of London School of Economics in 2010. He started organizing informal workers' organizations under a common platform with a view to transform their living and working conditions towards drastic reduction in the levels of poverty and social marginalization, which underlies informal work in Nigeria. I've known Mr. Benga Komolafe for quite a while now. He's doing so much great work within Lagos, and I think it'll be great to hear from him around how we can finance and fund projects that are favorable to people. And I think what Oliver was mentioning about the informal sector comes up quite well in his own work. So over to you, Mr. Komolafe.
Thank you very much, Olamide, and let me congratulate you for being very consistent with the Bridge series. And I think I should also commend the fact that you are very focused on some of the themes I've always tried to address on how the general welfare of the greatest number of people can be positively affected through public policy. Since I've not been actually given a specific theme to address, I will just take the liberty to talk very broadly about our concerns as people who work in the informal sectors of the economy, and how what public financing should be prioritized to meet some of those gaps that have been observed over time as far as the informal economy is concerned. Suffice it to say that of course, officially recognized that Lagos State, which happens to be the most industrialized state in Nigeria, actually is more or less an informal economy dominated. According to the NB, the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics, about 75% of the working people in Lagos actually work in the informal sector. And most of the work that people do in Lagos are also very informal. So we can also say that 75% of the economy itself is also predominantly informal. The reality is also reflected in critical sectors like housing in Lagos State, transportation, commerce, trade, and so on and so forth, which are all mostly dominated by informal operators. Now, this has a lot of implications. It means so many people are not captured by official statistics. So many people and what they do are also not captured in most urban development planning processes and the policies that evolve from those processes. So it's correct to say, as it has been very widely acknowledged, that informal work is marginalized, very largely unrecognized, and to a very large extent, especially in cities in Lagos, very highly repressed. So now for us in the informal economy, we are very concerned actually about issues around public projects, especially social projects that has to do with education, healthcare, basic infrastructure, especially in respect of sanitation, potable water provision, and basic physical infrastructures too, like roads and so on and so forth. So the issues are very clear as far as we are concerned, because the absence of some of these basic infrastructures is actually a matter of life and death for so many people. The fact, for instance, that there hasn't been well-focused, well-planned public investment in social housing, for instance, has meant that informal settlements and informal housing continue to proliferate. And that reality is contradicted by what seems to be government's preoccupation with what they see as modernization, which is to have neighborhoods that look like perhaps what we have in New York. And so there's a lot of evictions of this informal settlements. And that means that over time, so many people have been so terribly impacted. So for us, the issue of what should constitute priority in that respect is very clear. We can talk about the fact that people don't have access to potable water and the implications for basic healthcare. The fact that the absence of potable water means so many people easily fall sick of waterborne diseases, especially typhoid nowadays, and people die of these diseases because the hospitals are also not there for them to access. Then in terms of education, apart from the formal system of education, which is very important, because those informal workers also want to ensure that their own children have access to education, which most of them were deprived of for one reason or for whatever reason. And we are also concerned about the fact that there is no sufficient attention and investment in what we see as continuous vocational and technical education to bridge gaps in terms of capacity and knowledge about new technologies, because technologies are changing and being transformed on a daily basis. And so people need to be continually trained and retrained on how to make use of some of these new technologies, at least to improve their work, boost their productivity, and perhaps even that way transit from informal to more formal work settings. So these are some of the critical issues. And of course, we are also concerned about soft, quote and unquote, issues as gross human rights violations we have in the informal sector, the arbitrary arrest and detention of street vendors, for instance, the arbitrary evictions from informal markets and informal workspaces, which has actually led to hundreds of thousands of people losing their livelihoods, and has also further deepened the level of precarity of life in the city of Lagos. So these are issues that we are generally concerned about when we talk about public finance. We advocate that public finance should be made to address some of these issues. I listened carefully, and it's interesting. I mean, to the last speaker, and it's interesting that I started with reference to the Brazilian model of participatory budgeting, which actually is a process that enables citizens to also help draw what should be the priorities of public spending and public finance. I also find interesting is a discourse of the source of finance, whether it comes from some federal allocation or whether it is locally generated. That the tendency is when revenues are locally generated, there's better delivery of services than when the money comes from somewhere else, and people feel less pressed to give accounts. I think that is generally true, but unfortunately, in a city like Lagos, or in a state like Lagos, which has actually been most successful in terms of generating public revenue locally, that reality has not necessarily translated to better delivery of public and social services, despite the fact that Lagos generates the highest level of what we call IGR, internally generated revenue in Nigeria. It has not really translated to better servicing, especially in those broad areas I mentioned earlier: public education, public healthcare system, water and sanitation, and investment in vocational and technical education, which are areas that can actually help to transform the nature of work in the informal sector, and can actually help to transform a lot of the informality to more formal work arrangements, and with the positive implication that definitely will lead to better productivity and better living standards for the citizens, and of course more capacity for the government to also generate revenue in terms of taxation from people who are not earning more and all of that. So so for us, the issues are very clear. We insist that enough and sufficient attention are not being given to these very basic services. Now, the other, and that's where we'll end in terms of social services, is the aspect of social protection. And this one area where informal workers have suffered the highest level of marginalization and neglect, because nobody cares about the fact that people working in the informal sector have no access to any sustainable form of old age care and support system. Women in the informal sector have no access to any form of maternal care and support system, unlike in the more formal setting where at least employers by law have to respect women maternity rights, give them time off work, and also even support them while going through the process of childbearing and all of that. So in the informal sector, all of these are absent. And of course, we also have to talk about the fact that the healthcare system generally is so bad that, and of course, most informal workers cannot access the new dominant form of healthcare now, which is private sector driven health insurance. Health insurance works for people who have regular income, who have predictable incomes, and who can a little bit more conveniently pay for premium and all of that. In the informal sector, it just doesn't work, because the base from which you can begin to fund for individuals to fund private health care through the health insurance system is just not there. And so the government have been talking about, they even passed a law that makes it mandatory for Lagosians to be part of the health insurance system. But that law is no starter, because the truth is that for most people, most Lagosians who happen to work in the informal sector, there is no mechanism for them to be part of that kind of system. So given that reality, there is the necessity for more focus for government investment in making public health more accessible, especially at the community levels. So these are the basic issues that informal workers grapple with, especially in the context of COVID-19 and what it has meant, and the response of government to trying to address the challenges occasioned with that epidemic. The reality is that again, the informal sector are in the lurch. There are all sorts of programs by government, ostensibly, to assist people through the COVID-19 pandemic. But the targeting has been extremely poor. The process has been extremely opaque, non-transparent. So nobody knows. Hello? Okay, so nobody knows exactly how much is being spent and how what is being spent gets to the recipients and so on and so forth, and whether these recipients are actually people working in the informal sector and so on and so forth. So these are some of the contradictions that bedevil public finance, the public finance system. So there is the need for better prioritization to make public finance a little bit more pro-poor. There's also the need to, which also stress the need for more participatory public expenditure management systems, such that citizens at all levels can be part of the budgeting process and can also help to actually draw priorities about their own needs. When we have that kind of system, everybody can see what is available, and everybody can also be able to be part of saying, determining how the little or much that is available is going to be spent, you know, which the Brazilians actually experimented with from the 80s. So these are some of the directions that some of us stress in our advocacy with government and so on and so forth. So maybe I should just stop there for now, just to underscore the fact that for us, issue around public finance is really very simple and straightforward. There must be better prioritization of public spending, and to target those who need public services most, especially in the informal sector. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Mr. Benga Kumafe. Just to make a couple of things that kind of were highlighted to me during your presentation. You've just, as you mentioned, the prioritization of investment. Where does public funding go? And really the lack of investment in social housing, education, vocational education, and healthcare. I think you mentioned a couple more, but I think those are the ones that really stood out to me. The idea of participatory budgeting, and maybe there are ways that we can learn from other cities who have done this. I don't know any project that has happened in Nigeria where this has taken place, but please, if anyone knows of any, that would be really great to show. And I think actually Oliver has put something in the chat, so I'll try and read it in a second. And then, social protection for informal workers, and the fact that the role of policies and implementation. So you were talking about healthcare specifically, and that the policies are there, but then of course, what's happening in terms of implementation? Well, how do we go from the policies to implementing these policies, and making sure that the people who need specific healthcare services do get them? And then lastly, you talked about COVID-19. I think this is a really big one. And of course, since the advent of the spread of COVID-19, every seminar and every discussion has kind of had that in it. But what you mentioned and what kind of jumped out to me was about more transparency, the need for more transparency, and the need for poor prioritization of whether it's soft or hard infrastructure. I think we've all felt it in Nigeria, even when thinking about, NSAS and so on, and the need for that kind of switch of thinking in regards to how we prioritize spending, public spending in Nigeria, or in Lagos specifically, because that's where I live anyway. So thank you, Benga Komolafe. Thank you so much, Oliver Harmon, as well, for your presentations. The idea now is to really open the floor, and if anyone has any questions, they can just raise their hand or just unmute. It's really supposed to be kind of like an open discussion. And that's the idea of the Bridge series. And now it's quieter, so I can talk a little bit more, I guess. But yeah, so that's the idea of the Bridge series. So please, if you have any questions or comments, and I think what might be nice to talk about, for me anyway, is this idea of, PPP, public-private partnership, is something that Lagos State is pushing a lot. And as a consultant with UN Habitat, you hear that PPP is not always the way to go. PPP is not, the most, it doesn't give the most social benefits. So, my question maybe to both speakers is, then what is the right way to think about public financing? Because obviously Lagos State is very much about public-private partnership. So that's my first question. But if anyone has any questions, please do raise your hand and share your questions. So maybe we'll go to Oliver for thinking about this kind of PPP agenda that we currently have at the moment.
I might take huge liberty and bring in my colleague who's here, who is currently literally writing some work on PPPs at the moment. And I might see if he's not going to be too willing, of course, but he's a much better voice on this than potentially I am. Sharak, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that question, or Olamide, do you want to just ask it again?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm on my phone and also doing a bit of errands while listening into the conversation. I hadn't prepared anything, but my broadest few thoughts. Well, the first thing is that it's true that PPPs are very popular, and in large part because you can defer initial capital investment from for governments to the private sector, and because of that, you can effectively start more infrastructure projects through the procurement tool. But what cross-country evidence tells us is very clear that PPPs work well in some circumstances and really poorly in others. And like most other fiscal instruments, they need a lot of state capacity and the right project to work efficiently. So one of the things we have recognized is that when PPPs are used to circumvent state capacity, it doesn't work. So if the idea is that we're going to do a PPP because the government has no money and doesn't have the right people to deliver this service or infrastructure, that PPP contract is very likely, or is often more likely to fail, because state needs capacity to monitor and design and procure and make sure that the project and the contract is done properly. The second thing is that not everything is suitable, and I think this goes back to Oliver's points on different projects are suited for different things. So especially if you cannot exclude people where you can't charge user fees, for instance, those contracts are usually not well suited for PPPs because the government needs to pay the private party to deliver that service. And when you need to do that, it's very hard for you to measure the quality. And there's a lot of exposure to effectively patronage and capture from the private sector. So, those would be my two big thoughts. So just figuring out what the right project is, and not every project is the right project. So building a highway would be something that would be more suited. And second is build the capacity within the state, and don't try to circumvent state capacity through PPP contracts. So it's never as easy as it seems. So there's no such thing as free money. I hope that made sense. I'm just thinking out loud here. There's a lot more I can say about it, but I hope that's useful.
It was to me, Sean. I think in the spirit of discussion, it was nice to bring you in and get your thoughts on that. But I do, yeah, I agree. I think that project thing is quite important, right? I think I remember seeing a PPP used for sort of street lighting, right? And that kind of goes against a lot of the principles in a way. Like, how can you, who's necessarily paying? You can't exclude people from street lighting. You can't, there's no like revenue stream from that. So therefore you end up having to spend kind of property taxes on it. But actually that's probably better spent on something that, and I think it goes back to that policy framework. But anyway, I see a raised hand, so.
Yes. Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Oliver, for that. It makes a lot of sense. I just also wonder. So then, what is the solution? But I guess every project. The solution has to be found for every individual project. So Posi has his hand up. Ade Posi.
Hi.
Yeah, go ahead.
Good evening. I want to say that I really enjoyed the presentation. I really love the spectrum of these interventions, those that are exclusionary, sort of, in their nature. I also love the fact that you brought up this idea of the multiplier effect of social projects and how it tends to have more impact and benefits than this more hard infrastructure. I'm not an economist, so I don't really know much about the terms. But I think that with this discourse of PPPs, it seems to me that the motive and the narrative that is usually behind them is more on this trying to climb the ladder, trying to increase the state usually wants to increase its revenue, it wants to get more money, and it wants to avoid poverty. And there is this tendency to run away from poverty. And I think that really needs to be addressed because, this global economics is a game that is, you can't play in a game that is designed against you. So I think it's very important that African leaders or leaders in our cities need to rethink their priorities and focus. But with respect to, I think that CSOs are very critical actors in this landscape. And I think that the relationship between the CSOs, when I mean CSO, I mean civil society organizations, need to be strengthened because they're doing work already in cities. They have a mandate, that motive that I think is rather more suitable. And I think that one way or the other, governance needs to acknowledge and involve these more. So these are my few thoughts.
Great, thanks, Posi. Okay, so we have Lanre Shagaya has his hand up, but 1 second, we also have some people from PPP office, so I'm going to come to you next, but after Lanre asks, go ahead and ask your question or make your comment.
Okay. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for this. Like everyone has said, I have many questions, percolating because it's just a lot of information. But I'll just ask one. Basically, how like Mr. Komalafi was sort of implying, I think we have to have the paradigm shift to incorporate or support the informal sector, and not go along Western development paradigms, because that's like Oliver pointed out in one of his charts, our GDP is so low, like it's very important to have targeted funding, for the funding to be targeted properly. And we've always had this paradigm of just eliminating the informal sector. And I don't know if, are there any ideas out there of how to get government in Lagos specifically look at developing residential properties for the or the Okada band and all that, how can we incorporate the informal sector and not just push them aside and have a more, a better way to use our funds and develop in our own local context.
Great.
Hello?
Thanks, Lamre.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Okay.
Lamre. Thanks. I don't know, Mr. Komalafe, do you want to say something at this point about how we can, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, one can say a few things. I want to commend Mr. Shaku. I hope I got the name right, the pronunciation right. His contribution about PPPs, because that has become another huge scam in this part of the world. Like he did say, PPPs can be very useful. PPP can be a source of funding for very important projects, but PPPs should also not be used, like he said, to circumscribe state capacity to do what they are supposed to do. PPPs should not become a weapon of nepotism, should not become what you use to actually screw up everybody. What we have had in this part of the world is a situation where projects that are obviously better handled by the state contracted out to private sector, the government and at the end of the day, the government is supposed to provide so much, while the private sector supposedly brings in funding and at the end of and expertise, quote and unquote. But at the end of the day, you have government doing virtually all the spending, and while the private sector just take all the benefits without actually investing anything. We've had situations where PPPs have been used for road construction, and at the end of the day, it was public fund that was used. Specifically, I'm talking in reference to the situation, the Lekki corridor. It was public fund that was used to build that road. But you have a so-called concession company actually collecting tolls that does not go to public purse, go into the purse of a private company that have not actually really invested anything in that project. So for me, that's just fraud, and we've had quite a lot of that. So PPP, when again, it is just yet another instance of abuse of public finance in this part of the world. What could otherwise have been a very good source of funding for some critical public projects become another conduit for screen of people and just stealing public funds. Then the issue around what can the government do about transforming the informal economy. Actually, there is no depth of ideas about what can be done. Interestingly, most international development institutions in recent times have been focused on ideas of what can be done. So the International Labour Organizations, for instance, talks about the need to transit, what they call the transitioning from the informal to the formal. And the content of that basically is that the government must recognize the formal sector for what it is. In Nigeria, it is said to contribute almost 60% to the GDP. So you don't continue to ignore that. The government needs to invest strategically in the informal sector by helping to also improve the content and nature of the labor market itself through training and capacity building. And I did mention that earlier. There must be more investment in technical and vocational training. Most employers bear responsibility for retraining of their employees. But in the formal economy, because of the reality, government must step in to actually, provide that critical service. I can give you a lot of instances of what technical training, the imports, what it has meant. I will give you just one example. A few years ago, we discovered that auto technicians in most parts of Nigeria, couldn't handle mechatronic engines because they weren't trained with that type of technology. They were trained with carburation engine. So this new highly electronic automobiles were coming, and they couldn't cope with maintenance and repair, and so we had to intervene at some point. And fortunately, we got a federal government agency to take interest in our concerns, and they were able to invest quite very modest sum of money in training thousands of auto technicians across the country, and that has had a lot of multiplier effect, because those folks that were trained were also able to help train their own colleagues, and of course they also train. We also have a formal form of training in these sectors, so they also help train their apprentices in these new technologies. And that has meant that there is greater efficiency in repair of automobiles. There are less incidents of auto technicians actually destroying people's vehicles and all of that. It's also about safety too, because if you mess up with somebody's vehicle, that will also result in accident, and so on and so forth. So I use that just as an example of what training and retraining actually means, and that cut across all the sector. And it's not just about new technology. There's also the need for training around occupational health and safety issues. There's need for training around
sorry, Mr. Komolafe,
entrepreneurial training. Yeah.
Sorry, not to cut you off, just to make sure that more people have time to say something.
Okay.
Yes. Do you want to say one last thing, or?
Yeah, just to sum up by saying that there are no depth of ideas. So you have the ILO recommendation 204, you have the SDG 8 and 11, which dwells a lot about some of these issues. You have the New Urban Agenda, which also talks to this issue, the need for government to invest in training, retraining in the informal sector, the need to invest in provision of conducive workspaces for people to do their work, the need to invest in technological transition, and so on and so forth. So these are simple things which are not very high cost items that will actually help to transform the informal sector and graduate a lot of them into formality and better productivity. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Mr. Menga. Oliver, do you want to also talk about that change in mindset and how funding can be more inclusive?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I do think. So I think one of the things that we often say is, in terms of engaging with the informal sector, is like, have the informal sector kind of, organize in certain aspects. But it seems like that's already the case with Mr. Komolafe, right? And there are already those ideas out there. I think that this, I think there's something we talk about. Well, economists, we always talk about scarce resources, right? There's only so much resources available. And I do think in terms of these interventions, those sort of, as I indicated, like at the beginning, both those bottlenecks, which, can be figured out by both asking people and research. I think, I found that with the logistics stuff just online, but also, you can survey people and find those things out quite fairly easily. And I think that the intervention Mr. Komolafe said at the beginning, in terms of the informal people aren't in the data, and therefore the policies aren't the informal workers people, but the informal workers are, not in the data, and therefore the policies are not designed around their needs. And I think, of course, I'd say this is somewhat a researcher in an academic institution, but I do think there's a criticality in like bringing them out and getting kind of, understanding these needs and getting them in the data. And then, of course, people are going to react and incorporate their views a bit more. I think the other thing that is, is important is this sort of notion of best buys with scarce resources, right? What are the kind of social and or private returns per dollar to some of these different interventions? It's perhaps it can be orientated to be inclusive, but I do think it's an important way when we're thinking about what we're kind of funding and financing, right? And going back to my initial presentation, something that the highest returns you can see is a lot in terms of like early years kind of education and early years early years education and care. That's when like cognitive ability and brains really develop at a kind of an exponential rate. And if you are going to be spending money, that is quite that's a very good way of doing it. And there's also some really interesting research, again links with what Mr. Colin Maffley was saying around adult retraining, because some schemes are very effective in doing this, and others don't quite get the returns as well. So I think going back and understanding what is particularly effective is useful in articulating that to ultimately the people with the purse strings. And that's something we do try and do at IGC, to kind of bring this empirical base so that you can wave some literature in front of someone and change their mind and make sure they are making more kind of pro-poor or pro-informal choices. Because ultimately I think in a lot of cities, the informal sector is a very considerable part of their economy, but actually, to tie back to COVID-19, I think we've seen it kind of as that somewhat a social safety net, where there haven't been formal social safety nets. That has kind of been somewhat resilient in a way that it kind of captures the fallout from the kind of loss of employment seen elsewhere. But I'm perhaps those would be my thoughts anyway.
Great, thanks, Oliver. So I wanted to now invite is it Adebayo Ogidan from the Office of Public-Private Partnership. I think he also has a colleague here as well. If they might want to mention something, since we're all talking about PPP right now. Are you there, Adebayo?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Yes. It's actually raining here. I don't know if you can hear my voice. If my voice is projected enough, I don't know.
Yeah, we can hear. We can hear.
Yeah. Okay. So I've been following the conversation, and I want to thank the Bridge series, Ludi as well, for bringing this kind of informative session for us to know and get to discuss what is happening in the state of Nigeria. And as you all know, Lagos, we are the frontline state in terms of a whole lot of developments, frontline states in PPPs as well. And I would want to just pass this little information about, the Lagos state government playing pivotal roles in the formation of the NPPN. Understand, the National Public-Private Partnership of Nigeria Forum. So speaking of PPPs in Nigeria, we as the PPP office, our mandate is the fact that we are a pivotal enabler, in the delivery of infrastructural delivery in Lagos State, and for us to see that Lagos State is moving forward as as one of the frontline cities in not even sub-Saharan Africa, but Africa as a whole, and for us to be projected as one of the, you know, the most successful states in terms of PPPs in the world. So the thing about PPPs is we as PPP office, we meet a lot of private investors, a whole lot of them. We meet a whole lot of private investors, and, you know, we've had our own fair share of, you know, approved PPP projects. We might not be seeing them now, but as we all know, there are a lot of PPP projects that, you know, they are long-term. The tenure is long-term. But presently, one of the you know, the factors that is limiting the delivery of PPP projects in Nigeria is funding. You understand? You can't do any PPP project without private funding. And the way it is, it's a public-private partnership. And and according to international best practice, all right, we are supposed to leverage on the finance capacity and expertise of our private investors, you know, for them to invest in Lagos, to make Lagos a better place. But most of the time when we review some of the proposals sent to us, all right, we find out that, you know, the proposals are being bought, laudable ideas. You understand what I'm saying? Laudable ideas that, you know, that you will look at and be like, okay, from looking at it, just merely looking at the proposal, reviewing the proposal from the technical point of view, it can fly. But when you ask them for funding, where are you getting the funds from? You get what I'm saying? So we want to bridge that, you know, that lacuna between the private sector and the public sector in terms of funding. The state cannot afford to, you know, to fund projects that are way more than the annual budget, the annual appropriation bill. You understand what I'm saying? So we need help from the private investors, because we cannot do it all alone. Another one is when we look at many of the private owned, you know, many of the private owned businesses. Let's put it like that. Many of the government owned businesses. Apologies for that. Many of the government owned businesses. We observe that, you know, it's not as if we lack the technical expertise, but the private, the investment world is more favorable to the private investors, because they are the ones that are aware of the, you know, of the current best practice, and we want them to bring the current best practice to us. You understand what I'm saying? So delivering PPP projects is not the problem. It's the fact that we need to, you know, not that we need to narrow down, because we receive a lot of proposals. A lot of people want to do projects with the Lagos State government, because they see Lagos State government as a viable market, a market that can embrace, you know, that can embrace change, that can adapt, because we have the population. We may definitely not really have the land area, but we have, you know, the teeming population in Lagos, and the youth population and everything. You understand? Can abort the quest for jobs, can abort the viability of any project that wants to be introduced. We have some. Before I round up, we have some.
Yes. Sorry, round up, because we have about 5 minutes left.
We have some projects. If they say that we are not seeing, they've not been seeing the 3D projects in Lagos that has been executed in Lagos. We have some projects I can just point out to you. Some of them are even in the pipeline. We have the Fourth Mainland Bridge, the proposed Fourth Mainland Bridge project. We will understand that would reduce traffic. You get what I'm saying? We have the MCCs, the mother and child care centers in Etiosa and Co. We have the which one of this? We have the last two hostels. We just recently signed the last two hostels, and it is currently being we concluded the groundbreaking, I think 4 to 5 months ago. So we're actually working. We're actually working to make Lagos State a better place. But we need the private investors to not only bring their funds, not to show us the funds. We need to see the funds. We need to make sure that the funds are there for them to execute the projects they are proposing. So thank you very much, everyone, and God bless Lagos State.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I think, Lanre, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, I did. Real quick. Yeah, just for Mr. Adebayo. There's the federal PPP scheme of tax credits for road infrastructure development. I was just wondering if Lagos State is doing anything like that. Tax credits to large companies. Yeah, like I know, like the Dangote Group and.
Sorry, I can't really hear him.
Okay. So he's asking about tax credits and initiatives like that with the private sector. He's wondering if Lagos State is doing any of those kind of initiatives, working with private sector and giving tax credits as an incentive.
As of now, I'm not aware of that because I'm one of the project managers in the Office of Public-Private Partnerships. You understand? So I don't know. But the thing is, we welcome any kind of initiative as far as it's going to aid the people of Lagos. We welcome anyone. So if you can pitch to us. We have our website, the PPP info@ppplagos.ng. You can go there. You can call our numbers, our hotlines as well, so we can check for you. I'm not in the office right now. I would have just skimmed through our project list because we have a whole lot of them. You understand? So I don't know if that answers your question.
That's fine. I think it's more about incentives to encourage private sector to partner. But I think we can. I mean, maybe we can send you the question later so you can also look and see if that's something that Lagos State is doing or interested in doing as well, as it's I think what Larry was saying is a federal government initiative at the moment.
Okay.
So yeah. So thanks so much. I just want to know if there's any last questions because we just need to round up. Any last question before I ask the speakers to kind of give their final comments? No? Okay, so I think I'll go back to the speakers and maybe we can speak a little bit about participatory budgeting because we didn't really get to speak about that, and I think it might be quite interesting to understand what other options are there when it comes to working, social infrastructure, implementing social infrastructure. And that was one that was mentioned, I think, by both Mr. Kamalafe and both Oliver Harman. So maybe as you're closing, maybe just talk about other options in terms of financing, because we're talking about PPP a lot. So maybe Mr. Benga, maybe you can go first.
Okay, Olamide. Mr. Oliver actually tried in the chat room to provide a very useful explanation of what participatory budgeting means. It's the whole spectrum of what we call PPM, or participatory public expenditure management. It's about making public finance and the budgeting process participatory, open, and transparent. Unlike what we have right now, whereby the budgeting process is very closed. We don't know how people arrive at the priorities they define, the kind of project they want to execute. We don't know how they arrive at those projects. Everything is so heavy, top down. And so that's members of the public are alienated from this process. And it works very fine for corruption to thrive. It works very fine for cronyism, political patronage, and all form of clientelist behavior that bedevils our public expenditure management systems generally. So the Brazilian example, for instance, is about making citizen groups through their organizations, civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations, so on and so forth, even faith-based organizations, be part of the budgeting process. They are involved in the entire circle, formulation, determining the priorities, actual implementation and tracking, and then evaluation and all of that. So citizens are involved, and so because of that, it helps to minimize a lot of corruption. It helps to ensure optimal use of public funds. There are the other forms. People also use of other forms of, people have also tried to use other forms of participatory public expenditure management mechanisms. You have what we call report cards, for instance. I think that has been very popular in India, for example, where citizen groups actually score performance of public projects and public services. Citizens actually score whether public education is optimal, whether the services provided, what the money invested, and so on and so forth. So there are all sorts of efforts all over the world trying to ensure that people get value for public funds, with varying degrees of successes and so on and so forth. Well, like you did opined, I'm not sure that we are about to do any of this here. There has been some attempts by a few NGOs, but of course, in a situation where people can't even access the budget. For instance, in Lagos State, making the budget available, the entire comprehensive budget available on Lagos State government website has been an issue. What we have is just a little summary, that actually says little or nothing about what comes in and what's going to get spent on different budget lines. So the whole process is very closed. The opportunities for citizen groups to intervene in the process, to try and make it more transparent, is virtually impossible when people can't even access the budget, when people can't even access basic information about the budget, talk less of being part of deciding the priorities that go into the budget in the first instance. So we're a long way from some of these ideals that PPEMs try to promote, making the budget process transparent, making sure that, and if you go through the literature, you discover that it's done a lot of good where people have actually used this method to manage public finance. It has resulted in better value for money. Government has been able to do much, much more than they used to do before we started having this kind of participatory budgeting processes. So I think it's something that we should all advocate for and in this part of the world, and see how we also use it to promote more transparent budgeting process.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Kamalafe. That's great. Thank you so much. Oliver, do you want to just some last comments?
Yeah, I'll be brief. I mean, yeah, so you're kind of talking about implementing good ways of funding and implementing social infrastructure. And I think it goes back a little bit to my comment, right, the initial presentation. In able to implement social infrastructure, you need to be also making sure you're implementing like the non-social infrastructure. Right. In order to fund social infrastructure, you need to be making sure you're funding the non-social infrastructure in a more effective way. So like non-social infrastructure, your sort of hard infrastructure or hard urban development projects, that can work well through like land and property taxes, because you build a virtuous circle. If you build a road near to people, their land or property value will increase. If you build a public park next to people, their land and property value will increase. Therefore, you get more taxation if that's working well, which sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And then you can invest more in that hard infrastructure kind of aspect. And I think Governor Fashola understood this quite well at parts during his term as Lagos State Governor, and was really able to like maximize this kind of social contract between people, between citizens and state. They understood that they were paying their land and property taxes, they were getting these services, they were seeing kind of increase in their assets, and this really and more infrastructure, so their livelihoods increased. And I think once you kind of got those aspects working, then you can also then the social projects are almost will become easier to fund, because your scarce resources are like, there's almost like they're better defined. But with those social projects, because they have this like collective welfare benefit, then it does also make sense to think, okay, that's when you do need perhaps to engage and collaborate with national government, because as a city, you can't necessarily, it's more tricky to capture the gains from a more skilled citizen, because that more skilled citizen could potentially move to another city. Then their income taxes are more often captured at a central government level, and then it's about that kind of collaboration and making sure that there's this understanding that the projects that are benefiting, having these social merit at the local level, are contributing to this kind of the national productivity and prosperity, and making sure that kind of funding mechanism is also working. So yeah, I suppose that would be my my last comments, just to hark back to some of the key messages I started with.
Great, thank you so much, both to Mr. Benga Kolafe and to Oliver Herman. Thank you. From what everyone has said, it just sounds like there's a lot of work to do. In regards to even just thinking about tax and thinking about different ways of financing and funding projects, public projects, social projects, hard infrastructure, soft infrastructure. It seems like we have to really kind of think about it holistically, and think about the whole picture, because they actually all interlink together. So there's a lot of, just to me, it sounds like there's a lot of work done. I'm not an economist either, so I don't know the jargon, but I think what you've done, both speakers have done, is kind of simplify it for us to kind of understand how it works, well, for me anyway, at least, and how it could work in Lagos, in Nigeria. What are the good takeaways? What are the projects that are actually happening already? And what are the good takeaways, and maybe what we can learn from as well. So thank you both for that. It was really kind of educative, informative, and also just to thank the PPP Office of Public-Private Partnership for attending, coming, and contributing, and to everybody else that has contributed. Thank you so much. I know everyone did write their names and organizations. I'm not going to list everyone individually, but thank you very much for attending and contributing. And we'll write a little report after this and share the video as well, the recording as well. So thank you, and looking forward to the next Bridge series.